Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the surprisingly murderous world of Tudor England. We're being Queen Mint having a target painted on your back in permanent ink. Picture yourself walking through the shadowy corridors of Greenwich Palace in 1558, where every whispered conversation could be plotting your death. Every loyal courtier might harbor secret Catholic sympathies, and even your morning porridge could theoretically contain enough arsenic to drop a horse. You're about to become Elizabeth I, and honestly, you probably won't survive this statistically speaking. Most people targeted by 20 separate assassination plots don't tend to reach old age, with all their limbs intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing our global community of insomniacs and history nerds unite in the pursuit of educational unconsciousness. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're born in 1533, and already the seeds of future assassination attempts are being planted in the fertile soil of religious paranoia and political instability. Your father, Henry VIII, has just broken with Rome to marry your mother, and Boleyn, creating a schism that will echo through European politics for decades. Half of England still considers you illegitimate, which is never a great starting point for future personal security. The Catholic Church has essentially declared your very existence an affront to God's natural order. And when you're dealing with people who believe divine mandate trumps earthly law, well, let's just say they tend to get creative with their problem-solving methods. Your early childhood is spent in this bizarre liminal space where you're simultaneously a princess and a bastard, depending on who's asking and what political winds are blowing that particular week. This theological uncertainty about your legitimacy creates the perfect breeding ground for future conspiracies. After all, if you're not really the rightful queen, then killing you isn't regicide. It's practically a public service, at least according to the twisted logic of your future would be. Assassins. The machinery of assassination is already being assembled around you. Though you're too young to understand it yet, Catholic priests across Europe are beginning to whisper about the illegitimate daughter of the whore of Babylon. Charming nickname really shows the sophistication of 16th century political discourse. These early theological discussions about your legitimacy will later provide the intellectual framework that allows otherwise reasonable people to convince themselves that murdering a queen is actually God's work. Your half-sister Mary's reign from 1553 to 1558 is particularly crucial in setting up your future assassination buffet. Mary's attempts to restore Catholicism through fire and sword create a generation of Protestant martyrs. But they also create something more dangerous, a generation of Catholic true believers who see religious warfare as their sacred duty. Historians still argue whether Mary's persecution actually strengthened Protestant resolve, or simply taught both sides that violence was an acceptable political tool. But either way, you inherit a kingdom where people have gotten uncomfortably comfortable with the idea of killing for Christ. During Mary's reign, you're walking the world's most dangerous tightrope. You're Protestant enough to be suspicious to the Catholic establishment, but not Protestant enough to be trusted by the more radical reformers. You attend Catholic Mass when required, but everyone knows your heart isn't really in it. This religious ambiguity that keeps you alive during Mary's reign will later become the very thing that makes you a target from all sides. Catholics see you as a heretic, while some Protestants will eventually see you as insufficiently reformed. The Spanish connection begins during this period as well. Philip II of Spain, Mary's husband, represents the leading edge of Catholic counter-Reformation politics. He is not personally plotting your death yet, that comes later, but his very presence in England establishes the networks and relationships that will eventually channel Spanish gold into English. Assassination plots. Philip's courtiers and administrators are quietly taking note of who's who in the English Catholic community, filing away names and loyalties for future reference. Meanwhile, You're developing the psychological tools that will keep you alive through 20 assassination attempts. Living under constant suspicion teaches you to read people's faces like weather patterns, to hear the subtext in every conversation, to sleep lightly and trust sparingly. These aren't conscious skills, yet you're still in your early 20s. But the foundation is being laid for the paranoid vigilance that will characterize your entire reign. The economic factors are crucial too. England in the 1550s is not the maritime powerhouse it will be. Ecom. It's a relatively minor player caught between the great Catholic powers of France and Spain. Your future assassins won't just be religious fanatics, they'll be backed by the treasuries of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. Foreign gold will flow into English pockets, turning theoretical religious disagreement into very practical murder plots. You're also inheriting a government apparatus that's not quite ready for the age of international espionage and religious terrorism that's about to dawn. The Tudors have always relied on a combination of personal loyalty and spectacular public punishment to maintain order. But that's not going to cut it when you're facing coordinated international conspiracies funded by foreign powers and justified by competing theological frameworks. As Mary's reign draws to a close in 1558, you can almost feel the future crystallizing around you. The players are taking their positions, the ideological justifications are being prepared, and the international networks that will funnel money and personnel into England are beginning to form. You're about to become queen of a nation where half the population questions your right to rule, where foreign powers see your death as a strategic necessity, and where religious fanaticism provides ready-made justification for political murder. The stage is set for a reign that will be defined as much by the plots that fail as by the policies that succeed. You ascend to the throne in November 1558, and immediately the irony of your situation becomes apparent. Your first serious assassination threat comes not from Catholics trying to restore the old faith, but from Protestant rebels who somehow think killing you will advance the Protestant cause. Welcome to the wonderfully contradictory world of Tudor politics, where your allies are sometimes more dangerous than your enemies, and logic takes a permanent vacation. The Wyatt Rebellion had actually occurred 4 years earlier, in 1554, but its aftermath continues to cast shadows over your early reign. Thomas Wyatt the Younger had led a Protestant uprising against your half-sister Mary's marriage to Philip II of Spain, and while you weren't directly involved, the rebellion established some uncomfortable precedents about how religious dissent could quickly turn into armed insurrection. More importantly for your future health, it demonstrated that even Protestants were willing to use violence to shape England's religious destiny. You're now dealing with the surviving networks from that rebellion, men who proved they were willing to take up arms against a Tudor monarch in the name of Protestant purity. These aren't your garden variety political malcontents. These are people who have already crossed the line from dissent to treason once before. The fact that you're Protestant too doesn't automatically make you safe from their enthusiasm, especially since your version of Protestantism is considerably more moderate than theirs. The paranoia from the Wyatt period has also created a security apparatus that's jumpy, suspicious, and prone to seeing conspiracies everywhere. Your Privy Council includes men who lived through Mary's reign, who remember how quickly religious tensions can explode into open rebellion. They're not wrong to be nervous. The problem is that their nervousness sometimes makes them see threats where none exist, while simultaneously missing the real dangers that are beginning to coalesce around you. Some of the former Wyatt conspirators are now in exile on the continent, nursing their grievances and maintaining contact with Protestant radicals still in England. Historians still argue whether these exile networks posed a genuine threat to your early reign, or were mostly just disgruntled expatriates writing angry letters to each other. But from your perspective, the distinction hardly matters. Angry expatriates with military experience and international connections have a way of becoming genuine threats when the circumstances are right. The theological complexity of your position begins to emerge during this period. You're Protestant, But you're not Protestant enough for the real firebrands. Your religious settlement seeks to find a middle way between Catholic ritual and Protestant theology, which sounds reasonable until you realize that in the 16th century, moderation is often interpreted as weakness or, worse, secret sympathy for the other side. Some of the more radical Protestants are beginning to whisper that you might be a crypto-Catholic, which is a polite way of saying they think you're a heretic. Who deserves whatever fate befalls heretics? The Spanish factor is already beginning to complicate your security picture. Philip II is technically your brother-in-law through his marriage to Mary, but he's also the champion of Catholic counter-reformation in Europe. He's not actively plotting your death yet, that comes later, but his very existence as a powerful Catholic monarch creates opportunities for English Catholics to dream of foreign intervention. More immediately relevant to your current situation, Philip's agents are still in England, still maintaining their networks, still sending reports back to Spain about the political temperature of your new Protestant regime. Your early religious policies are walking a tightrope that would make a circus performer nervous. You're trying to establish a Protestant church that's Protestant enough to satisfy the reformers, but not so Protestant that it drives the Catholics into open rebellion. This means you're simultaneously too radical for the Catholics and too conservative for the Protestant extremists, a position that pretty much guarantees someone's going to try to kill you eventually. The economic dimension of potential assassination is also becoming clearer. Religious warfare is expensive, and successful conspiracies require funding. The former Wyatt rebels who are now in exile need money to maintain themselves and their networks. Some of them are beginning to explore creative funding mechanisms, which is a euphemistic way of saying they're starting to consider taking money from foreign powers in exchange for services rendered against the English crown. Your personal security arrangements are still relatively primitive by the standards of what they'll become later in your reign. You're relying heavily on personal loyalty and the assumption that English gentlemen generally don't assassinate English queens. This assumption will prove to be overly optimistic, but for now, it's all you've got. Your guards are competent enough, but they're not prepared for the kind of sophisticated international conspiracies that are beginning to form around you. The legal framework for dealing with assassination attempts is also still evolving. Treason law exists, obviously, but it's not quite calibrated for the new reality of religiously motivated international terrorism. That's about to become the defining feature of your reign. Your legal advisors are smart people, but they're thinking in terms of traditional English political rebellions, not coordinated international conspiracies funded by foreign treasuries and justified by competing theological systems. You're also beginning to understand that your unmarried status makes you a particularly attractive target for conspiracy. An unmarried queen with no clear heir represents an opportunity for anyone who thinks they can manipulate the succession to their advantage. Every potential husband is a potential threat. Every marriage negotiation is a potential security risk. And every month you remain unmarried is another month that ambitious people can dream of alternative arrangements for the English throne. The psychology of your would-be assassins is beginning to take shape during this period. These aren't random madmen, they're people who have convinced themselves that killing you would serve a greater good. The former Wyatt conspirators tell themselves they're defending true Protestantism from compromise and corruption. The Catholics tell themselves they're restoring God's church from heretical usurpation. Both groups have developed elaborate intellectual frameworks that transform murder into martyrdom, treason into righteousness. As 1559 dawns, you can feel the pieces of your assassination puzzle beginning to fall into place. The players are positioning themselves, the justifications are being refined, and the international situation is creating opportunities for domestic discontent to find foreign backing. You're settling into your new role as queen, and across the channel in Spain, Philip II is having some very serious thoughts about your continued existence. It's 1559, and the Spanish infiltration networks that will plague your entire reign are beginning to take Think of it as the 16th century equivalent of a very slow, very Catholic, very murderous social media campaign, except instead of trolling you online, they're planning to stab you in person. Philip II is not yet your active enemy. The relationship will take a few more years to fully mature into mutual assassination attempts, but he is already beginning to see your Protestant England as a strategic problem that requires a strategic solution. The Spanish bureaucracy is remarkably efficient when it comes to international conspiracy, and they're starting to compile lists of English Catholics who might be willing to accept Spanish gold in exchange for Spanish-friendly political outcomes. Your death isn't necessarily the primary goal yet, but it's definitely on the table as a potential policy option. The Spanish infiltration method is beautifully subtle in its initial phases. They're not sending obvious spies with fake mustaches and suspicious accents. They're cultivating relationships with English Catholics who have perfectly legitimate reasons to travel to Spain or maintain correspondence with Spanish contacts. English merchants doing business in Spanish territories. English students studying at Spanish universities. English Catholics making pilgrimages to Spanish shrines. All of these become potential channels for Spanish intelligence gathering and influence operations. The theological justification for what's about to happen is being carefully constructed during this period. Spanish theologians are developing increasingly sophisticated arguments about why Protestant monarchs have no legitimate claim to rule Catholic subjects, and why Catholic subjects have not just the right, but the duty to resist heretical authority. These are abstract academic discussions. They're the intellectual infrastructure that will later support very concrete assassination plots. When you're dealing with people who believe God has commanded them to kill you, rational deterrence becomes somewhat less effective. Your English Catholic subjects are finding themselves in an increasingly impossible position. They want to be loyal to their queen, but they're also being told by their spiritual authorities that loyalty to a heretical monarch is itself a form of heresy. Spanish agents are becoming very skilled at exploiting this theological tension, offering English Catholics a way to resolve their conflicted loyalties through direct action against your person. It's psychological manipulation dressed up as spiritual guidance, and it's remarkably effective. The economic dimension of Spanish infiltration is particularly insidious. Spain in 1559 is wealthy in a way that England simply isn't. Spanish gold from the Americas is flowing into European markets, and some of that gold is being set aside for what we might politely call political investment in England. Spanish agents aren't just offering English Catholics spiritual absolution for treason. They're offering them hard cash as well. The combination of religious justification and financial incentive proves to be remarkably persuasive for people who are already feeling conflicted about their political loyalties. The Spanish approach to intelligence gathering is also becoming more sophisticated. They're not just collecting random gossip, they're systematically mapping the English Catholic community, identifying potential assets, assessing vulnerabilities, and planning long-term operations. Spanish agents are learning who's who in English Catholic circles, who has access to court, who has financial problems that might make them susceptible to bribery, and who has the kind of personality that might be susceptible to flattery, ideology, or simple desperation. Your security services are not yet prepared for this level of sophisticated foreign intelligence operations. English political culture has traditionally been fairly straightforward. Your enemies usually announce themselves and then try to stab you in broad daylight. The Spanish approach of cultivating long-term assets, establishing deep-cover networks, and planning operations that might not come to fruition for years is something entirely new in English experience. Your advisors are smart people, but they're thinking in terms of traditional English political rebellions, not modern intelligence warfare. The religious dimension of Spanish infiltration is particularly complex because it exploits genuine spiritual concerns. English Catholics aren't just being bribed or blackmailed into disloyalty, they're being convinced that disloyalty is actually a form of higher loyalty, that betraying their earthly queen is the only way to remain faithful to their heavenly king. This kind of theological jujitsu makes Spanish infiltration particularly dangerous, because it turns your subjects' best instincts against you. The Spanish are also beginning to coordinate with other Catholic powers during this period. French Catholics, Italian Catholics, and Spanish Catholics are starting to see English Protestantism as a common threat. That requires a coordinated response. This isn't yet a formal alliance that comes later, but the intellectual and diplomatic groundwork is being laid for the kind of international Catholic conspiracy that will characterize the middle years of your reign. Historians still argue whether Spanish infiltration networks were as extensive and effective as English Protestant propaganda claimed, or whether Spanish capabilities were exaggerated by paranoid English observers who saw Spanish agents under every bed. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Spanish infiltration was real and dangerous, but not quite as omnipresent as your more nervous advisors believed. Unfortunately, when you're the target of international assassination conspiracies, the difference between actual threats and perceived threats tends to become academic. Your personal response to this emerging Spanish threat is characteristically pragmatic. You're not panicking, but you're also not dismissing the danger. You're beginning to invest in your own intelligence capabilities, quietly building the networks and relationships that will eventually become the Elizabethan intelligence service. You're also beginning to understand that your reign will be defined as much by intelligence warfare as by traditional diplomacy and military action. The Spanish infiltration networks are also beginning to create a feedback loop that will define much of your reign. Spanish agents recruit English Catholics. English Catholics provide intelligence to Spanish agents. Spanish intelligence enables more sophisticated recruitment of English Catholics, and so on. Each successful recruitment makes the next recruitment easier. Each piece of intelligence gathered makes the next intelligence operation more effective. As 1560 approaches, you're beginning to understand that you're not just the Queen of England, you're the primary target of an international Catholic conspiracy that has the resources, the motivation, and the theological justification to keep trying to kill you until they succeed. You're now in 1571. And your first major assassination plot is about to unfold with all the dramatic flair of a badly written spy novel, except with a minor difference that if this particular spy novel goes wrong, you end up very dead. Enter Roberto Ridolfi, an Italian banker who apparently believes that international finance and international murder are natural business partners. Ridolfi is about to demonstrate that having too much money and too little sense can be a remarkably dangerous combination, especially when mixed with religious fanaticism and a flair for the theatrical. Roberto Ridolfi is, by all accounts, a genuinely charming man, the kind of person who can convince you to invest in his schemes while simultaneously planning your demise. He has established himself in London as a successful banker, which gives him perfect cover for the kind of international correspondence and money transfers that conspiracy requires. Banking in the 16th century is already an inherently international business, so Ridolfi's extensive network of European contacts doesn't raise any immediate suspicions. It's the perfect cover identity for someone who wants to coordinate an international assassination plot while maintaining plausible deniability. The Ridolfi plot is remarkably ambitious in scope. Ridolfi isn't just planning to kill you, he's plotting to kill you, install Mary Queen of Scots on the English throne, restore Catholicism, and fundamentally realign European politics all in one coordinated operation. It's the kind of plan that sounds brilliant in theory and completely insane in practice, which pretty much sums up most assassination plots throughout history. Ridolfi has convinced himself that your death will trigger a spontaneous Catholic uprising across England, because apparently he's never met any actual English people. The Spanish connection is crucial to the Ridolfi plot. Philip II has finally decided that your continued existence is incompatible with his strategic objectives. and he's prepared to provide both financial and military support for your removal. Spanish gold is flowing into Ridolfi's network, and Spanish military advisors are helping to plan the logistics of what they're calling a liberation, but what you would probably call an invasion followed by regicide. The Spanish are also providing intelligence support, helping Ridolfi identify potential English collaborators and assess the feasibility of various assassination methods. The Duke of Norfolk becomes the crucial English connection in Ridolfi's network. Thomas Howard, 4th Duke of Norfolk, is the most senior peer in England, which gives him access to court and makes him an invaluable asset for any conspiracy. Norfolk's motivations are complex. He's probably not primarily interested in killing you for religious reasons, but he is interested in marrying Mary, Queen of Scots, and potentially inheriting some of her claims to various thrones. This is a classic example of how personal ambition and political conspiracy can reinforce each other in dangerous ways. Mary, Queen of Scots is, of course, the intended beneficiary of your untimely death. She's currently your prisoner, but she's also maintaining an extensive correspondence network that includes some very unsavory characters across Europe. Mary's supporters have convinced themselves that your assassination would automatically trigger her restoration to the Scottish throne and her elevation to the English throne, which demonstrates a touching faith in the predictability of political succession during periods of violent upheaval. Historians still argue whether Mary was directly involved in planning your assassination, or was simply a passive beneficiary of other people's murderous ambitions. But either way, her very existence provides a convenient alternative around which conspiracies can coalesce. The actual assassination methods being discussed in the Ridolfi plot are almost charmingly primitive by modern standards. Ridolfi's associates are considering everything from poison to stabbing to shooting, but they haven't quite worked out the practical details of how to get close enough to you to employ any of these methods. The security around you isn't impenetrable, but it's adequate to defeat the kind of amateur-hour assassination attempts that Ridolfi's network is capable of mounting. They're enthusiastic conspirators, but they're not particularly competent ones. The intelligence failure that ultimately destroys the Ridolfi plot is almost comedic in its completeness. Ridolfi's correspondence network is extensive, but not particularly secure. He's relying on traditional diplomatic pouches and merchant networks that are already being monitored by your emerging intelligence services. When you're coordinating an international conspiracy, using the same communication methods that everyone else uses for legitimate business is probably not the optimal security strategy. But apparently nobody explained this to Ridolfi. Your spy master Francis Walsingham is beginning to demonstrate the capabilities that will make him legendary in intelligence circles. Walsingham's network is intercepting Ridolfi's correspondence, identifying his associates, and building a comprehensive picture of the conspiracy while Ridolfi remains blissfully unaware that his every move is being monitored. The contrast between Ridolfi's amateur-hour conspiracy and Walsingham's professional intelligence operation is stark. It's like watching a community theater group try to compete with the Royal Shakespeare Company. The unraveling of the Ridolfi plot provides you with your first real lesson in the psychology of international assassination conspiracies. These aren't random acts of violence, they're carefully planned operations that require extensive international coordination, significant financial resources, and sophisticated intelligence networks. The fact that the Ridolfi plot fails doesn't mean that future plots will be equally amateurish, and you're beginning to understand that you're facing a threat that will require a systematic, professional response. The aftermath of the Ridolfi plot also demonstrates the political utility of failed assassination attempts. The exposure of Ridolfi's network allows you to justify a significant expansion of your intelligence capabilities, a crackdown on Catholic networks in England, and a general tightening of security measures that might have been difficult to implement without The clear evidence of foreign-sponsored assassination attempts. Nothing justifies domestic surveillance quite like foreign agents trying to murder the Queen. The Duke of Norfolk's execution in 1572 provides a dramatic conclusion to the Ridolfi plot and sends a clear message to other potential conspirators. Norfolk's death demonstrates that even the highest-ranking English nobles are not immune to the consequences of treason, which is an important lesson for anyone else who might be considering Spanish gold as a career option. You're now dealing with what might be the most dangerous element in your assassination equation. Seminary priests who don't even realize they're part of an assassination conspiracy. It's the 1570s, and young English Catholics are traveling to seminaries in France, Spain, and Rome, where they're being trained as priests and then sent back to England on what they believe is a purely spiritual mission. Unfortunately, the line between saving souls and saving England for Catholicism turns out to be considerably thinner than anyone anticipated, and some of these well-meaning young clergymen are about to become unwitting accessories to murder. The seminary system is actually a brilliant piece of institutional innovation by the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Rather than relying on the older generation of English Catholic priests who remember the pre-Reformation Church, Catholic authorities are training a new generation of priests who are specifically educated to operate in Protestant England. These men are theologically sophisticated, personally committed, and absolutely convinced that they're engaged in God's work. They're also walking into England with exactly the kind of international connections and ideological fervor that make them perfect candidates for recruitment into assassination conspiracies. The most famous of these seminaries is at Douai in the Spanish Netherlands, where William Allen is training English Catholics to become missionaries to their homeland. Allen's curriculum includes not just theology and pastoral care, but also practical instruction in how to operate covertly in a hostile Protestant environment. The priests are being taught how to avoid detection, how to maintain secure communications, and how to build underground network skills that are equally useful for saving souls and for coordinating political conspiracies. Allen probably doesn't intend to train assassins, but he's certainly training men with the skills that assassins need. The psychology of these seminary priests makes them particularly dangerous to your continued health. They're young, idealistic, and absolutely convinced that Protestant England represents a spiritual catastrophe that requires dramatic intervention. They're also personally brave to the point of foolhardiness after all. They're voluntarily returning to a country where practicing their religion is illegal, and where being caught means torture and execution. When you're dealing with people who are already prepared to die for their faith, convincing them to kill for their faith becomes a much shorter logical leap. The Jesuit involvement adds another layer of complexity to your security concerns. The Society of Jesus is the elite intellectual force of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and Jesuit priests are specifically trained to operate in hostile environments. When Jesuits like Edmund Campion and Robert Persons began arriving in England in the 1580s, they bring not just theological sophistication, but also the kind of organizational skills and international connections that can transform scattered Catholic discontent into coordinated Catholic resistance. The problem with seminary priests from your security perspective is that they're genuinely engaged in spiritual work most of the time. They're saying Mass, hearing confessions, performing marriages, and generally doing the things that priests do. This makes it extremely difficult for your intelligence services to distinguish between priests who are purely focused on religious matters and priests who might be willing to expand their mission to include more political activities. When everyone looks like a legitimate clergyman, identifying the potential assassins becomes nearly impossible. The international networks that support these seminary priests are also perfectly positioned to support assassination conspiracies. The same routes that smuggle priests into England can smuggle weapons, money, and instructions. The same safe houses that shelter traveling clerics can shelter traveling assassins. the same coded correspondence that coordinates religious activities can coordinate political activities. The infrastructure of Catholic mission work is indistinguishable from the infrastructure of Catholic conspiracy, which makes your security problems considerably more complex. Some of these seminary priests are becoming radicalized beyond their original mission parameters once they arrive in England. They come expecting to find a Catholic population eagerly awaiting spiritual guidance, but instead they find English Catholics who are often more interested in keeping their heads down and avoiding trouble than in risking everything for religious restoration. This gap between expectation and reality can be profoundly disillusioning, and disillusioned idealists sometimes conclude that more dramatic action is necessary to achieve their goals. The Spanish connection to the seminary system provides another channel for recruitment into assassination plots. Spanish intelligence agents are cultivating relationships with seminary administrators, offering financial support for the training programs, and quietly identifying which priests might be suitable for more specialized missions. Not every seminary priest becomes an assassination conspirator, but every assassination conspiracy seems to include at least a few seminary priests who have been convinced that killing you is part of their religious duty. Historians still argue whether the seminary system was deliberately designed to produce political conspirators or whether the political conspiracies were an unintended consequence of religious training. The truth is probably that most seminary administrators were genuinely focused on religious restoration, but they were operating in a political environment where religious restoration inevitably became entangled with political conspiracy. When you're training people to operate covertly against a Protestant government, the line between religious resistance and political resistance becomes very difficult to maintain. Your government's response to the seminary priest problem illustrates the difficulty of dealing with threats that are simultaneously religious and political. You can't simply ban Catholicism. That would be both impractical and potentially counterproductive. But you also can't ignore the fact that Catholic priests are arriving in England with international connections, covert operational skills, and ideological motivations that make them natural recruits for assassination conspiracies. The solution is a complex system of surveillance, infiltration, and selective prosecution that tries to distinguish between harmless religious dissent and dangerous political conspiracy. The personal stories of individual seminary priests reveal the human dimension of your assassination problem. These are often genuinely holy men who believe they're serving God by returning to England. But there are also men who are increasingly convinced that serving God requires removing you from the English throne. The transformation from missionary to potential assassin isn't sudden or dramatic. It's a gradual process of theological reasoning and political frustration. That makes these priests particularly dangerous because they don't think of themselves as assassins at all. You're now face to face with the most persistent threat to your continued breathing. Mary, Queen of Scots, your cousin, your prisoner, and your most dangerous rival. It's like having a beautiful, charming, extremely Catholic time bomb living in your spare bedroom. Except this particular time bomb has a legitimate claim to your throne and an unfortunate tendency to attract assassination conspiracies like a magnet attracts iron filings. Mary has been your guest since 1568, and in the nearly 2 decades of her captivity, she's managed to become the focal point for virtually every Catholic plot against your life. Mary's situation is uniquely dangerous because she represents a perfect alternative to your rule that satisfies multiple constituencies simultaneously. English Catholics see her as their rightful queen. Scottish Catholics see her as their legitimate sovereign. French Catholics see her as their former queen. And Spanish Catholics see her as a useful tool for advancing their strategic interests. When you're dealing with a rival who can appeal to domestic dissidents, foreign powers, and religious fanatics all at the same time, your security problems become exponentially more complex. The practical mechanics of Mary-centered assassination plots follow a remarkably consistent pattern. Foreign agents make contact with Mary's supporters, Mary's supporters make contact with Mary herself. Mary either explicitly endorses the assassination plot or maintains plausible deniability, while clearly signaling her approval. And then everyone involved proceeds to demonstrate that good intentions and religious fervor are no substitute for actual competence in the assassination business. It's almost like watching the same tragic comedy performed over and over again by different amateur theater groups. Mary's correspondence network is a masterpiece of 16th century covert communications. She's maintaining regular contact with supporters across Europe through a system of coded letters, hidden messages, and trusted intermediaries that would be impressive if it weren't being used to coordinate your murder. Mary's letters are passed through a network of sympathetic nobles, Catholic priests, and foreign agents, creating a communication system that spans from the Scottish borders to the Spanish court. The fact that this network is eventually penetrated and exploited by your intelligence services doesn't diminish its initial sophistication. The French dimension of Mary's threat is particularly complex, because France has legitimate interests in Mary's fate that don't necessarily involve your assassination. Mary was Queen of France before she was Queen of Scots, and French policy toward England is influenced by their relationship with Mary as well as their broader strategic concerns. French agents are certainly involved in plots against you, but they're also pursuing diplomatic solutions that might restore Mary to some position of authority, without necessarily requiring your death. It's a delicate balance between regicide and realpolitik that keeps French involvement in Mary-centered conspiracies somewhat ambiguous. The Spanish approach to Mary is considerably more straightforward. They see her as a useful tool for advancing Catholic interests in Britain, and they're perfectly willing to support assassination plots that would place her on the English throne. Spanish gold flows regularly into Mary-centered conspiracies. Spanish agents provide intelligence and logistical support, and Spanish military advisors help plan the invasions that are supposed to follow your successful assassination. The Spanish are also realistic enough to understand that Mary's restoration would require not just your death, but also a comprehensive military campaign to suppress Protestant resistance. Mary's personal psychology makes her particularly dangerous as a focus for assassination conspiracies. She spent nearly 20 years in captivity, watching her life slip away while her cousin enjoys the throne that Mary believes rightfully belongs to her. This kind of prolonged frustration and resentment creates a psychological state where almost any action that might change the status quo becomes attractive, even if that action involves murder. Mary may not be personally planning to stab you in your sleep, but she's certainly willing to endorse other people's plans to do so. The religious dimension of Mary's appeal is crucial to understanding why she attracts so many assassination conspiracies. Mary isn't just a political alternative to your rule, she's a Catholic alternative. And for English Catholics who are increasingly frustrated with their position under your Protestant regime, Mary represents the possibility of religious restoration without the need for foreign conquest. The fact that Mary's restoration would actually require foreign military intervention is a detail that tends to get overlooked by Catholic conspirators, who are more interested in the theological implications than the practical logistics. Historians still argue whether Mary was an active participant in assassination plots against you or simply a passive beneficiary of other people's murderous ambitions. The evidence suggests that Mary was usually careful to maintain plausible deniability, while clearly signaling her approval of plots against your life. It's a sophisticated form of criminal leadership that allows Mary to reap the benefits of conspiracy, while avoiding direct responsibility for its consequences. Your security services face a unique challenge in dealing with Mary-centered assassination plots, because Mary herself is theoretically under your protection. You can't simply eliminate the threat by eliminating Mary. That would create a diplomatic crisis with France and Scotland, while simultaneously making Mary a martyr for the Catholic cause. Instead, you have to prevent assassination plots while keeping Mary alive. which is considerably more difficult than simply killing all of your enemies and being done with it. The psychological warfare aspect of Mary's captivity is also worth considering. Mary's very presence in England serves as a constant reminder to English Catholics that there is an alternative to your rule, while simultaneously demonstrating to potential conspirators that you're not willing to eliminate your rivals through simple murder. This creates a strange dynamic where Mary's captivity both enables assassination plots and constrains your response to them. The international legal implications of Mary's status also complicate your security situation. Mary is technically a sovereign queen in her own right, which means that assassination plots involving Mary can potentially be treated as legitimate diplomatic activities rather than criminal conspiracies. When foreign agents are coordinating with Mary's representatives, they can claim they're engaged in normal diplomatic correspondence rather than treasonous conspiracy, which makes it more difficult for your government to take direct action against them. As the 1580s approach, Mary's role as a magnet for assassination conspiracies is about to reach its climax with the Babington plot, but even now you can see the pattern that will define the rest of her captivity and the rest of your reign. You're in 1583, and Francis Throckmorton is about to demonstrate that being a well-connected Catholic gentleman with a talent for languages and a passion for international correspondence is not necessarily a recipe for successful conspiracy. Throckmorton represents a new evolution, and assassination plots against you. He is not a foreign agent or a religious fanatic, but rather an English Catholic who has convinced himself that coordinating with Spanish ambassadors to arrange your murder is somehow a patriotic act. It's the kind of logical pretzel that only makes sense if you've spent too much time reading Spanish propaganda and not enough time thinking about the practical consequences of treason. Francis Throckmorton comes from a family with impeccable credentials. For political conspiracy, his uncle Nicholas Throckmorton was deeply involved in the murky world of Elizabethan diplomacy, and Francis has inherited both the family's international connections and their unfortunate tendency to get involved in plots that are more ambitious than they are practical. Throckmorton has spent time in France, where he's been cultivated by Spanish agents who have convinced him that English Catholics are desperately awaiting foreign liberation from Protestant tyranny. This is a significant misreading of English Catholic opinion, but it's the kind of misreading that Spanish agents are happy to encourage. The Spanish ambassador Bernardino de Mendoza is the key foreign figure in the Throckmorton plot, and he represents a new level of sophistication in Spanish operations against you. Mendoza isn't just a diplomat, he's an intelligence officer who understands that successful conspiracy requires careful coordination between foreign resources and domestic assets. Mendoza's approach to Throckmorton is methodical and professional, building trust gradually, providing financial support carefully, and always maintaining plausible deniability for Spanish involvement in what could theoretically be described as an internal English political matter. The plot itself involves the familiar elements of Mary Queen of Scots' restoration, your assassination, and a Spanish invasion to support Catholic uprising in England. What makes the Throckmorton plot distinctive is its level of detail. Planning Throckmorton and his Spanish contacts have actually worked out logistics for landing Spanish troops, coordinating with English Catholic nobles, and managing the political transition that would follow your death. It's still a completely unrealistic plan, but it's an unrealistic plan that's been thought through with considerable care and attention to detail. Throckmorton's role in the conspiracy is primarily as a coordinator and intelligence gatherer. He is mapping English Catholic networks, identifying potential supporters for Spanish intervention, and maintaining communications between Spanish agents and English Catholics who might be willing to support Mary's restoration. Throckmorton is also gathering intelligence about English defenses, particularly focusing on potential landing sites for Spanish troops and the location of English Catholic nobles who might be willing to provide local support for a Spanish invasion. The religious justification For the Throckmorton plot follows the increasingly sophisticated theological arguments that Spanish agents are developing to justify assassination and invasion. Throckmorton has been convinced that Protestant rule in England represents a spiritual catastrophe that requires dramatic intervention, and that coordinating with foreign Catholic powers is not treason, but rather a form of religious duty. It's a compelling argument if you're already predisposed to believe that religious loyalty trumps political loyalty, but it's also an argument that conveniently ignores the practical consequences of foreign invasion. Your intelligence services are becoming increasingly sophisticated in their ability to detect and penetrate these Spanish-sponsored networks. Francis Walsingham's agents have been monitoring Throckmorton's activities for months before moving against him, building a comprehensive picture of the conspiracy and identifying all the major participants. The contrast between Throckmorton's amateur conspiracy and Walsingham's professional intelligence operation is stark. Throckmorton thinks he's operating covertly, but he's actually performing his treasonous activities under constant surveillance. The interception of Throckmorton's correspondence provides a detailed picture of how Spanish-sponsored assassination plots actually work in practice. The letters reveal the financial arrangements between Spanish agents and English conspirators, the specific plans for your assassination, the coordination with Mary Queen of Scots, and the broader strategic thinking that underlies Spanish policy toward England. It's a treasure trove of intelligence that allows your government to understand not just this particular plot, but the broader pattern of Spanish operations against you. Throckmorton's interrogation under torture reveals the extent of Spanish infiltration into English Catholic networks and provides names of other potential conspirators who might be involved in future plots. The information gathered from Throckmorton allows your intelligence services to roll up Spanish networks across England and to identify English Catholics who might be susceptible to future Spanish recruitment. It's a significant intelligence victory that significantly damages Spanish capabilities in England, at least temporarily. The diplomatic consequences of the Throckmorton plot are also significant. The clear evidence of Spanish Ambassador Mendoza's involvement in assassination plotting provides you with justification for expelling the Spanish ambassador and breaking off diplomatic relations with Spain. This is a major escalation in the conflict between England and Spain, moving from covert hostility to open diplomatic confrontation. Historians still argue whether the Throckmorton plot was a cause or a consequence of deteriorating Anglo-Spanish relations. But either way, it marks a significant turning point in the international situation. The execution of Francis Throckmorton in 1584 serves as a warning to other English Catholics who might be tempted by Spanish offers of gold and glory. Throckmorton's death demonstrates that collaboration with foreign powers against the English crown will be punished with the full severity of treason law, regardless of the religious justifications that conspirators might offer for their actions. It's a clear message that religious conscience does not provide immunity from political consequences. The broader pattern that emerges from the Throckmorton plot is that Spanish operations against you are becoming more sophisticated, more systematic, and more dangerous. The Spanish are learning from their previous failures, recruiting more competent agents, and developing better intelligence networks. The fact that the Throckmorton plot fails doesn't mean that future Spanish plots will be equally amateurish, and you're beginning to understand that the threat from Spain is escalating rather than diminishing. You find yourself in the peculiar position of watching Dr. William Parry pace nervously across the stone floors of Westminster in early 1585, his hands trembling as he clutches a confession that will either save his soul or damn his body. The air smells of damp wool and fierce wet, and you can almost taste the metallic tang of desperation that clings to every surface. In this gray February morning, Parry represents one of the most bizarre assassination plots against Elizabeth, a conspiracy so convoluted and contradictory that historians still argue whether the man was a genuine assassin, a double agent, or simply a delusional fool caught between competing loyalties. Your breath fogs in the cold air as you observe this middle-aged Welshman, a man whose life reads like a rejected script for a comedy of errors. Parry had somehow managed to convince himself that murdering Elizabeth would be both a patriotic act and a mortal sin, a logical contradiction that apparently kept him awake at night. He'd spent months in Europe, supposedly gathering intelligence for Elizabeth's government while simultaneously plotting her death, though which mission was real remains frustratingly unclear, even to modern scholars. The peculiar thing about Parry's confession is how he keeps changing his story, like a man trying to remember a dream while still half asleep. One moment he claims Cardinal Allen and Rome blessed his assassination mission. The next he insists he was only pretending to be a Catholic conspirator to better serve Elizabeth. You watch him fidget with his doublet, a nervous habit that betrays his awareness that confession might not actually save him from the executioner's blade. What makes this plot particularly sleepy-inducing is how thoroughly Parry managed to bungle every aspect of his conspiracy. Unlike the sophisticated networks of Ridolfi or the passionate young nobles of Babington's circle, Parry operated as a lone wolf who couldn't decide which pack he actually belonged to. He'd approach potential co-conspirators with all the subtlety of a town crier, practically advertising his treasonous intentions to anyone who listened. Modern intelligence experts suggest he might have been suffering from some form of mental illness, though 16th century diagnostics weren't exactly up to DSM-5 standards. You notice how the morning light filtering through the narrow windows illuminates the dust motes, dancing around Parry's head, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that seems entirely inappropriate for discussing royal murder. The irony isn't lost on you that this man, who claimed divine inspiration for his assassination plot, looks more like a confused parish priest than a hardened killer. His confession reveals a mind tormented by competing religious loyalties he genuinely believed. Elizabeth was a heretic queen leading England to spiritual damnation, yet he also served in her parliament and had sworn oaths of loyalty. The timeline of Parry's plot unfolds with the languid pace of honey dripping from a spoon. After returning from his European travels in 1584, he'd spent months wrestling with his conscience, writing letters to fellow Catholics, and generally making such a spectacle of his internal conflict that is remarkable Elizabeth's spy network took so long to notice him. Historians still argue whether Walsingham knew about Parry all along and simply let him incriminate himself, or if the spy master was genuinely caught off guard by this bumbling would-be assassin. What's particularly drowsy about this entire affair is how Parry's method of assassination was never clearly defined. Unlike other conspirators who plan elaborate poisoning schemes or coordinated attacks, Parry seemed to think he could simply walk up to Elizabeth and, what exactly? Stab her with a dinner knife, challenge her to a theological debate unto death. His confession is frustratingly vague on the practical details, suggesting he put about as much planning into the actual murder as you put into your average Tuesday morning. The religious dimension of Parry's plot reflects the broader spiritual exhaustion that was settling over Catholic resistance movements by the mid-1580s. After decades of failed conspiracies, persecution, and exile, many English Catholics were beginning to question whether violent resistance was actually God's will, or simply human pride disguised as divine mission. Parry embodied this uncertainty, constantly seeking signs and confirmations that never seemed to arrive with sufficient clarity. You can almost hear the scratching of quills on parchment as court scribes record every word of Parry's rambling confession, their steady rhythm creating a soporific soundtrack to this slow-motion catastrophe. The man's inability to maintain a coherent narrative makes even his interrogators drowsy, and you find yourself sympathizing with the court officials, who had to parse through hours of contradictory testimony from a witness who couldn't seem to remember which side he was actually on. The denouement of the Parry plot arrives with all the dramatic tension of watching paint dry on a humid afternoon. After months of investigation, hand-wringing, and theological soul-searching, Parry is finally executed at Westminster in March 1585. still maintaining his innocence while simultaneously confessing his guilt. The crowd that gathers to watch his death seems more confused than bloodthirsty, uncertain whether they're witnessing the end of a dangerous traitor or simply a very public mental breakdown. Remember how the Ridolfi plot involved international banking networks and papal communications. Perry's conspiracy, by contrast, never extended beyond his own fevered imagination and a handful of equally confused correspondents. It's the kind of assassination attempt that makes you want to pat the conspirator on the head and suggest he take up gardening instead of regicide. A career change that would have benefited everyone involved. You drift into the summer of 1586, where the scent of honeysuckle mingles with the far less pleasant aroma of conspiracy. Brewing in the shadows of English manor houses, here, you encounter Anthony Babington, a 24-year-old Catholic gentleman whose boyish good looks and romantic idealism make him the perfect candidate for what will become the most famous and most thoroughly documented assassination plot against Elizabeth. The warm July air carries whispers of treason as you watch this naive young man surround himself with equally passionate, equally doomed companions who genuinely believe they can change the course of English history with nothing more than youthful enthusiasm and misguided faith. Babington moves through his Derbyshire estate with the confident stride of someone who has never truly faced consequences. His silk doublet catching the afternoon sunlight as he entertains thoughts of glorious martyrdom. You can almost smell the leather-bound books in his library, where he's been reading stirring accounts of Catholic saints and heroes, each story feeding his growing conviction that God has chosen him for a special mission. What makes this plot particularly sleep-inducing is how thoroughly predictable every step becomes. Once you understand that Babington approaches conspiracy with all the strategic sophistication of a university student planning a harmless prank, the young conspirator's circle reads like a roll call from England's most prestigious Catholic families, men with names like Chidiock Tichborne, John Savage, and Robert Barnwell, each one more eager than the last to prove his devotion to the old faith. You watch them gather in candlelit chambers, their faces flickering between shadow and light as they whisper about honor, duty, and the righteousness of their cause. Historians still argue whether these young men were genuinely dangerous, or simply playing at being dangerous, like children with wooden swords dreaming of knightly quests. What's particularly drowsy about Babington's conspiracy is how it unfolds with the methodical precision of a well-rehearsed play, each act building inevitably toward a conclusion that everyone except the conspirators can see coming. The plot officially begins when Babington receives what he believes is a secret letter from Mary Queen of Scots, praising his loyalty and encouraging his plans to free her from captivity. The paper feels heavy in his hands, weighted with royal approval and divine blessing, though you know something he doesn't, that every word has been carefully crafted by Walsingham's forgers to draw him deeper into incriminating correspondence. The summer heat seems to make everyone drowsy and careless, including Babington himself, who begins writing detailed letters outlining his assassination plans, with all the discretion of a man announcing his intentions in the town square. His correspondence reads like a medieval romance novel, full of flowery language about noble sacrifice and righteous vengeance, completely lacking the hard-edged pragmatism that might actually accomplish something. You can almost hear the soft scratching of his quill as he composes these self-incriminating documents, each sentence another nail in his eventual coffin. The practical details of Babington's assassination plan reveal the fundamental disconnect between his romantic idealism and harsh reality. He envisioned 6 gentlemen approaching Elizabeth during one of her public appearances, somehow overpowering her guard through sheer force of righteousness and spiriting her away too. Well, that part was never entirely clear. The logistics seem to have been worked out with all the thoroughness of someone planning a weekend hunting trip, complete with the same casual assumption that everything would somehow work out perfectly. You notice how the conspirators' meetings take on an almost ritualistic quality, gathering at regular intervals to rehash the same basic plan without ever addressing its obvious flaws. There's something deeply soporific about watching intelligent men convince themselves. That wishful thinking can substitute for careful planning, like observing a group meditation session, where everyone agrees to ignore physical reality. The summer afternoons blur together as they debate theological justifications for regicide while completely ignoring practical considerations, like escape routes or backup plans. The religious fervor that drives Babington and his companions creates its own drowsy atmosphere, filled with lengthy prayers, scriptural quotations, and earnest discussions about divine will that seem to go in circles without ever reaching concrete conclusions. Unlike the cold calculation of earlier plots, this conspiracy operates on pure emotional momentum, sustained by the kind of passionate intensity that burns brightly but briefly, like a candle in a summer breeze. What makes this plot particularly tragic in a very sleepy, inevitable way is how genuinely these young men believe in their cause. You watch Babington's face as he reads what he thinks are Mary's letters, seeing the pure joy and determination that light up his features. He's not motivated by personal gain or political ambition, but by a sincere conviction that he's serving God and saving England's soul, a motivation that makes his eventual fate feel both deserved and deeply sad. The technical aspects of the conspiracy reveal just how thoroughly Walsingham has penetrated Catholic networks by this point. Every letter Babington writes is copied, every meeting is observed, every plan is known to Elizabeth's government before the conspirators themselves have finished discussing it. You can almost imagine the Queen's spy master reading these intercepted communications with the weary satisfaction of a teacher grading predictably incorrect exam papers, each document confirming what he already knew about the plot's inevitable failure. Remember how Dr. Perry's plot collapsed under the weight of his own confusion? Babington's conspiracy follows a completely opposite trajectory, maintaining perfect internal consistency and unwavering commitment right up until the moment when reality intrudes with arrests, trials, and executions. It's the difference between a conspiracy that dies of its own contradictions and one that marches confidently toward its doom with eyes wide open. Both equally doomed, but for entirely different reasons. You find yourself slipping into the shadowy world of Francis Walsingham's intelligence network, where the air smells of ink, sealing wax, and the faint metallic scent of coins changing hands in darkened taverns. The steady rhythm of your footsteps echoes through the corridors of surmise as you follow England's first true spy master, a man whose pale, angular face and perpetually black clothing make him look like a walking memento mori. What's particularly soothing about observing Walsingham at work is the methodical, almost meditative way he constructs his web of informants. Each connection carefully planned and patiently cultivated like a gardener tending to particularly delicate flowers that happen to bloom with secrets instead of petals. The morning light filtering through diamond-paned windows illuminates stacks of intercepted correspondence on Walsingham's desk, each letter a small victory in his quiet war against Catholic conspirators. You can almost hear the soft scratching of his clerks' quills as they copy, decode, and catalog every piece of intelligence that flows through his network. Their repetitive work creating a drowsy soundtrack to the business of national security. Historians still argue whether Walsingham invented modern espionage or simply perfected techniques that had existed for centuries. But there's no disputing that his systematic approach transformed intelligence gathering from a haphazard collection of rumors into something resembling a science. What makes Walsingham's operation particularly sleep-inducing is its emphasis on patience and routine over dramatic confrontations. Unlike the passionate conspirators who plot Elizabeth's death, her spy master operates with the steady persistence of water wearing away stone, building his network one careful recruitment at a time. You watch him interview potential agents with the same meticulous attention he might give to selecting fabric for a new coat, evaluating each candidate's motivations, capabilities, and most importantly, their capacity for keeping secrets under pressure. The physical infrastructure of Walsingham's spy network spreads across Europe like a vast, invisible web, each strand carefully maintained and regularly tested. Safe houses in Paris, coded correspondence routes through the Low Countries, and discreet meeting points in English port towns all require constant attention and funding. You can almost smell the salt air and hear the creaking of ships' rigging as messages travel back and forth across the channel. Each packet of intelligence another thread in the tapestry of surveillance that surrounds every major Catholic conspiracy. The recruitment process for Walsingham's agents reveals the spy master's deep understanding of human nature, particularly the art of turning people's weaknesses into strengths for intelligence work. Debt-ridden nobles become sources of information about court gossip. Disillusioned priests provide insights into Catholic networks, and ambitious young men eager to prove their loyalty find themselves carrying messages they don't fully understand. The whole system operates on the principle that everyone has something they need badly enough to compromise their principles. A cynical but effective approach to building a reliable intelligence network. You notice how Walsingham's personal study feels like a monastic cell, furnished with the bare minimum necessary for his work, but nothing that might be considered luxurious or comfortable. His Protestant faith infuses every aspect of his intelligence operations, creating a sense of divine mission that makes the long hours and constant stress feel like forms of religious devotion. The man genuinely believes he's serving God by protecting Elizabeth, which gives his surveillance network a moral weight that earlier, more mercenary intelligence operations lacked. The technical aspects of Elizabethan espionage have a wonderfully soporific quality, involving hours of careful work with invisible inks, cipher wheels, and microscopic handwriting that requires magnifying glasses to read properly. You can almost feel the eye strain that comes from examining intercepted letters for hidden messages, the mental fatigue of decoding communications that were never meant for your eyes. The cryptography of the period operates on principles simple enough to understand, but complex enough in execution to require genuine expertise, creating a perfect balance between accessibility and sophistication. What's particularly drowsy about Walsingham's methods is how thoroughly he documents everything, creating archives that read like the world's most boring novels. Every agent's recruitment, every payment made, every piece of intelligence received gets recorded in ledgers that transform the exciting world of espionage into columns of figures and carefully neutral prose. These records provide modern historians with unprecedented insight into how intelligence networks actually function, though reading them requires the kind of patience that naturally induces sleep. The international dimension of Walsingham's operations requires a level of coordination that would challenge modern intelligence agencies, all accomplished through handwritten correspondence that takes weeks to cross Europe. You can almost feel the weight of responsibility that comes with managing agents in hostile territory, knowing that a single mistake or betrayal could cost lives and exposures of careful work. The constant anxiety of not knowing whether your latest instructions have been received or whether your best agent has been captured creates a background tension that somehow makes the routine administrative work feel almost relaxing by comparison. Remember how Babington's conspirators operated with passionate enthusiasm, but no practical planning. Walsingham's network represents the complete opposite approach: methodical, patient, and utterly lacking in dramatic flair. His agents don't engage in sword fights or dramatic confrontations. They simply watch, listen, and report back with the same reliability as clockwork mechanisms. The whole system operates on the principle that information is more powerful than violence, a philosophy that proves remarkably effective at preventing assassinations through early detection, rather than last-minute heroics. The psychological toll of running such an extensive spy network begins to show in Walsingham's personal correspondence, where hints of exhaustion and paranoia creep into his normally controlled prose. The constant awareness that enemies might be watching him just as carefully as he watches them creates a peculiar form of professional anxiety. like a chess player who must always think several moves ahead while never being entirely certain of his opponent's strategy. Yet there's something oddly comforting about observing a man who has turned vigilance into a form of meditation, finding peace in the very activities that would drive most people to distraction. You step into the opulent chambers of Dr. Rodrigo Lopez in the winter of 1593, where the air carries the mingled sense of exotic spices, medicinal herbs, and the faint metallic tang of fear that seems to cling to everything like morning dew. The flickering candlelight dances across shelves lined with glass vials, leather-bound medical texts, and curious instruments that speak to a lifetime spent in the intimate service of royalty's most private ailments. What makes this particular assassination plot so deliciously drowsy is how it unfolds in the hushed, confidential atmosphere of the royal physician's consulting room, where whispered conversations about remedies and treatments allegedly mask discussions of a far more permanent cure for England's Protestant problem. Lopez moves through his well-appointed rooms with the measured gait of a man accustomed to being trusted with secrets, his graying beard and gentle manner making him appear more like a kindly grandfather than a potential regicide. You can almost hear the soft rustling of his silk robes as he examines bottles of imported compounds, each one labeled in his careful handwriting with names that sound more like poetry than pharmaceutical. L of vitriol, powder of sympathy, essence of antimony. The irony isn't lost on you that this man, who has dedicated his life to preserving health and treating illness, now stands accused of planning the ultimate malpractice. The background of Lopez's alleged conspiracy reads like a meditation on the complexities of religious identity in Elizabethan England. Born into a Portuguese Jewish family that had converted to Christianity under pressure, he represents the kind of multiple loyalties that make Renaissance espionage so fascinatingly complicated. You watch him handle his medical instruments with the same careful attention he presumably gave to his various religious and political allegiances, each identity carefully maintained and strategically deployed depending on the circumstances. What's particularly soporific about the Lopez plot is how it emerges not from passionate religious conviction or youthful idealism, but from the mundane world of international debt collection and financial obligations. The Spanish crown apparently owed Lopez money for previous services, creating the kind of bureaucratic entanglement that could only exist in an age where personal physicians also served as informal diplomatic agents. Historians still argue whether Lopez was actually planning to poison Elizabeth, or simply got caught in a web of financial and political complications that spiraled beyond his control. The alleged method of assassination reveals the intimate nature of the physician-patient relationship in ways that are both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Lopez supposedly planned to use his privileged access during medical consultations to administer poison, transforming the act of healing into its complete opposite. You can almost imagine the Queen lying vulnerable on her couch, trusting completely in her doctor's care while he allegedly contemplates her destruction. Betrayal so profound it seems to violate the natural order of things. The technical aspects of Renaissance poisoning have a wonderfully drowsy quality, involving careful calculations of dosage, timing, and delivery methods that require the kind of patient attention to detail that naturally induces sleep. Lopez would have needed to consider the Queen's weight, general health, recent meals, and numerous other factors to ensure his poison worked effectively without being immediately detected. The whole process reads like an extremely morbid cooking recipe, complete with precise measurements and careful attention to presentation. What makes this plot particularly sleep-inducing is how it gets discovered not through brilliant detective work or dramatic confrontations, but through the tedious process of analyzing intercepted correspondence for financial irregularities. Walsingham's successors notice unusual patterns in Lopez's communications with Spanish agents, payments that don't quite add up, and references to medical supplies that seem suspiciously vague. The investigation unfolds with all the excitement of an accounting audit, each discrepancy carefully documented and cross-referenced until a pattern of potential treason emerges. The religious dimension of Lopez's case reflects the broader exhaustion that has settled over Catholic resistance movements by the 1590s. Unlike the passionate conspirators of earlier decades, Lopez represents a more pragmatic approach to opposition, less interested in martyrdom than in practical solutions to practical problems. His alleged willingness to commit regicide seems motivated more by financial pressure than religious fervor, suggesting that even assassination plots were becoming increasingly businesslike and professional. You notice how the investigation into Lopez's activities takes on the rhythm of a slow-moving river, each piece of evidence flowing naturally into the next without dramatic revelations or sudden breakthroughs. Court officials pore over financial records with the same methodical attention that monks might give to copying manuscripts, their work creating a paper trail that gradually builds an overwhelming case against the royal physician. The whole process has a hypnotic quality that makes even treason feel routine and administrative. The personal tragedy of Lopez's situation becomes apparent when you consider how completely his various loyalties have become irreconcilable. His Jewish heritage, Christian conversion, Portuguese origins, English residence, Spanish financial obligations, and medical oath to Elizabeth create a web of competing allegiances that would challenge anyone's ability to navigate successfully. You can almost feel the weight of these contradictions pressing down on him like a heavy blanket, making every decision feel simultaneously right and wrong. Remember how Walsingham's spy network operated on the principle that information was more powerful than violence. The Lopez plot demonstrates how that same intelligence apparatus could be turned against individuals who might not even be genuine threats, creating a climate of suspicion where financial irregularities could be interpreted as evidence of murderous intent. The line between legitimate intelligence work and paranoid persecution becomes increasingly blurred as Elizabeth's reign enters its final decades. The denouement of the Lopez affair arrives with the kind of inevitable sadness that comes from watching someone destroy themselves through circumstances partly beyond their control. Whether Lopez was actually planning to poison Elizabeth, or simply got caught in a complex web of international finance and religious politics, his execution in 1594 removes one of England's most skilled physicians and demonstrates how thoroughly the atmosphere of conspiracy has poisoned even the most intimate relationships between ruler and subject. You find yourself crossing the windswept bogs of Ireland in the 1590s, where the persistent drizzle creates a gray curtain that muffles sound and makes everything feel wrapped in cotton wool. The air carries the earthy scent of peat smoke and the salt tang of distant seas, while your feet squelch through mud that seems to pull at your boots with each step, as if the very landscape is trying to slow your progress to match the languid pace of Irish rebellion. What makes the connection between Irish uprisings and Elizabeth's assassination attempts so deliciously drowsy is how these plots unfold across vast distances and extended time frames, with messages taking weeks to travel between remote castles and continental courts, creating conspiracies that move with all the urgency of geological formations. The Irish dimension of anti-Elizabethan plotting operates on a completely different timeline from the quick-burning conspiracies of English Catholics, developing with the patient persistence of moss growing on stone walls. You watch as Gaelic chieftains gather in drafty halls lit by flickering torches, their conversations flowing between Irish, Latin, and heavily accented English as they discuss the possibility of coordinating their local grievances with broader Catholic resistance movements. Historians still argue whether these Irish lords were genuinely committed to assassinating Elizabeth, or simply using the threat of regicide as leverage in their ongoing territorial disputes with English colonists. What's particularly soporific about Irish involvement in assassination plots is how thoroughly practical considerations override religious enthusiasm. Unlike the passionate young English Catholics who dream of martyrdom, Irish rebels approach the question of Elizabeth's death with the same methodical calculation they might apply to planning a cattle raid or negotiating a marriage alliance. The whole enterprise has the drowsy quality of a very long business meeting, with participants carefully weighing costs and benefits. While rain patters against diamond-paned windows and turf fires burn low in massive stone hearths. The geographical challenges of coordinating between Ireland and continental Europe create natural delays that transform urgent conspiracies into extended correspondences, each letter taking so long to reach its destination that circumstances often change completely before replies arrive. You can almost feel the frustration of conspirators trying to maintain momentum across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, their grand plans gradually losing coherence as weeks pass between communications. The whole process has the dreamlike quality of trying to have a conversation while walking through thick fog, with voices fading in and out as participants drift apart and come together again. The religious complexity of Irish involvement adds another layer of drowsy confusion to already complicated plots. Irish Catholicism operates according to its own traditions and priorities, often putting these rebels at odds with their supposed allies in Rome and Spain. You watch as papal representatives struggle to understand why Irish chieftains seem more interested in recovering stolen cattle than discussing theological fine points. Their meetings taking on the circular quality of conversations between people who share a language, but not a worldview. The practical mechanics of Irish-based assassination attempts reveal just how thoroughly geography shapes the possibilities of political violence. Any plot originating in Ireland must somehow transport conspirators across the Irish Sea, through English territory, and into proximity with Elizabeth, a logistical challenge that would daunt modern intelligence agencies equipped with rapid transportation and electronic communication. The whole enterprise feels like planning a military campaign using medieval resources, with success depending more on favorable weather than careful strategy. What makes these Irish connections particularly sleep-inducing is how they demonstrate the gradual expansion of what had begun as purely English Catholic resistance into a broader international movement. Irish rebels, Spanish agents, papal representatives, and exiled English Catholics all find themselves working toward the same general goal while maintaining completely different priorities and methods. Their conferences have the drowsy quality of academic symposiums, where participants spend more time explaining their basic assumptions than actually coordinating effective action. The seasonal rhythm of Irish rebellion adds another soporific element to these extended conspiracies, with military campaigns typically beginning in spring, reaching their climax during summer, and winding down as autumn approaches and winter makes large-scale movement impossible. You can almost feel the natural progression of these cycles, each uprising following the same basic pattern, with the predictable regularity of agricultural seasons. The whole process has a hypnotic quality that makes even warfare feel routine and inevitable. The financial dimension of Irish involvement in assassination plots reveals how thoroughly practical considerations dominate supposedly spiritual enterprises. Spanish gold, papal subsidies, and promises of future reward all play crucial roles in maintaining rebel morale. But the actual delivery of these resources requires the kind of complex international banking arrangements that would challenge modern financial institutions. You watch as promises of payment get delayed, renegotiated, and sometimes forgotten entirely, creating the kind of bureaucratic complications that could put an accountant to sleep. Remember how Dr. Lopez got caught in a web of international financial obligations. Irish involvement in assassination plots operates on an even larger scale, with entire rebellions depending on Spanish subsidies that may or may not materialize depending on political developments in Madrid, Rome, and various other European courts. The uncertainty creates a background anxiety that somehow makes the routine work of rebellion feel almost relaxing by comparison. The cultural gap between Irish rebels and their continental allies creates opportunities for the kind of mutual misunderstanding that transforms urgent conspiracies into extended negotiations about basic terms and conditions. Spanish agents arrive in Ireland expecting to find sophisticated political networks, similar to those in France or the Low Countries, only to discover that Irish chieftains operate according to completely different principles of loyalty, authority, and strategic planning. The resulting conferences have the drowsy quality of diplomatic meetings, where translation difficulties create more problems than they solve. The ultimate ineffectiveness of Irish involvement in assassination attempts demonstrates how geographic distance and cultural differences can neutralize even the most well-intentioned conspiracies. By the time Irish rebels receive word of opportunities to strike at Elizabeth, coordinate with continental allies, and organize their resources, the original circumstances have usually changed so completely that the entire enterprise becomes academic rather than practical. Like chess players trying to complete a game by mail while the rules keep changing. You drift into the royal stables at Greenwich Palace in the summer of 1598, where the warm air carries the comforting sense of leather oil, fresh hay, and that particular mixture of horse sweat and saddle soap that makes equestrian spaces feel like sanctuaries from the complexities of court. Life, the steady rhythm of horses shifting in their stalls, creates a natural lullaby, punctuated by the soft sounds of grooms going about their daily routines, with a kind of methodical attention that transforms even the most mundane tasks into forms of meditation. What makes Edward Squire's poison saddle plot so wonderfully drowsy is how it unfolds in this pastoral setting, where the gentle sounds of stable life mask one of the most creative and impractical assassination attempts in Elizabethan history. Squire himself moves through the royal stables with the easy confidence of a man who has spent years earning the trust of both horses and their riders, his weathered hands demonstrating the kind of practical skill that can only come from decades of working with leather, metal, and the unpredictable temperaments of royal mounts. You can almost smell the distinctive mixture of neat's foot oil and beeswax that he uses to condition the Queen's riding equipment, each application requiring the kind of patient attention that naturally induces a state of calm focus. Historians still argue whether Squire was a genuine Catholic conspirator or simply an opportunist who got caught up in circumstances beyond his understanding. But there's no disputing that his chosen method represents the pinnacle of creative thinking in Renaissance assassination planning. The technical aspects of the poison saddle scheme reveal a level of craftsmanship that would impress modern forensic scientists, involving careful application of toxic substances to leather surfaces in ways that would ensure absorption through skin contact during extended riding sessions. Squire supposedly planned to treat Elizabeth's favorite saddle with a compound that would gradually poison her through prolonged contact, a method so subtle and slow-acting that it might never be traced back to deliberate sabotage. The whole concept has the drowsy appeal of watching a master craftsman at work, each step carefully planned and executed with the kind of attention to detail that transforms criminal conspiracy into something approaching art. What's particularly soporific about this plot is how it demonstrates the intimate knowledge that royal servants possess about their employers' daily routines and personal preferences. Squire knew exactly which saddles Elizabeth favored, how long her typical riding sessions lasted, and what kinds of leather treatment would be least likely to arouse suspicion. You watch him examine various pieces of equipment with the practiced eye of someone who understands that the difference between success and failure often comes down to seemingly insignificant details like the thickness of leather or the temperature at which oils are applied. The Spanish connection to Squire's plot adds an international dimension that somehow makes the entire enterprise feel even more languid and dreamlike. His alleged recruitment by Spanish agents supposedly occurred during a previous mission to the continent, where patient handlers spent months cultivating his loyalty and teaching him the specialized techniques required for his assassination method. The whole process has the drowsy quality of an extended apprenticeship, with Squire gradually learning skills that have no legitimate application outside the world of political murder. The psychological dimension of the poison saddle plot reveals how thoroughly domestic settings can be transformed into spaces of potential danger through nothing more than shifted intentions and specialized knowledge. The same stables that represent safety, routine, and peaceful recreation suddenly become sites of potential regicide. Though nothing about their physical appearance or daily operations actually changes, you can almost feel the cognitive dissonance that comes from realizing how easily familiar environments can be weaponized by people who understand their hidden vulnerabilities. The timing of Squire's alleged plot coincides with a period of increasing paranoia about Elizabeth's personal security, as her advancing age makes her seem simultaneously more vulnerable and more precious to her subjects. Court officials begin paying closer attention to previously routine activities like writing, dining, and receiving visitors, creating an atmosphere of heightened vigilance that somehow makes everyday life feel both more intense and more soporific. The constant awareness of potential danger has a paradoxically calming effect, like the background hum of security that eventually becomes too familiar to notice. What makes this assassination attempt particularly sleep-inducing is how it represents the logical endpoint of Renaissance creativity applied to the problem of royal murder. After decades of failed plots involving swords, poisons, explosions, and various other dramatic methods, conspirators have finally arrived at something so subtle and indirect that it barely qualifies as violence in the traditional sense. The whole concept has the drowsy appeal of watching someone solve a complex puzzle through pure patience and ingenuity rather than force or passion. The investigative process that eventually exposes Squire's plot operates with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized his alleged crime, with the royal security officials carefully examining every piece of equipment in the stables for signs of tampering or unusual treatment. You can almost hear the soft sounds of leather being tested, oils being analyzed, and records being cross-referenced as investigators work through the physical evidence with the kind of thoroughness that would satisfy modern forensic standards. The whole process has a hypnotic quality that makes even criminal investigation feel like a form of meditation. Remember how Irish rebels struggled with the logistics of coordinating international conspiracies? Squire's plot represents the complete opposite approach, intensely local, requiring intimate knowledge of specific routines, and depending entirely on one person's specialized skills, rather than complex networks of conspirators. The contrast demonstrates how assassination planning had evolved from grand international schemes to focused, technical operations that prioritized effectiveness over dramatic impact. The ultimate failure of the poison saddle plot reveals how even the most creative assassination methods depend on factors beyond the conspirators' control, including the target's unpredictable changes in routine, the intervention of suspicious colleagues, and the simple bad luck that seems to plague most criminal enterprises. Squire's arrest and execution in 1598 ends what might have been the most sophisticated assassination attempt of Elizabeth's reign, though the technical details of his method remain frustratingly vague in historical records, leaving modern scholars to speculate about exactly how close he came to success. You find yourself in the austere meeting halls of England's most radical Protestant congregations, where the air carries the scent of plain wood polish and the faint mustiness of well-worn Bibles that have been thumbed through countless times during lengthy theological debates. The morning light filters through clear glass windows, no stained glass here, as such decorations are considered Papist corruption's illuminating faces that bear the particular expression of people who have discovered religious truths that somehow escaped everyone else's attention. What makes Puritan extremist threats against Elizabeth so deliciously ironic is how these conspiracies emerged from the very Protestant movement that she theoretically represents, creating the kind of circular firing squad that could only exist in an age where religious purity has become more important than political pragmatism. The paradox of Protestant threats against a Protestant queen unfolds with a slow, inevitable logic of theological perfectionism taken to its natural conclusion. You watch as earnest ministers and their equally earnest followers gather in sparse rooms furnished with nothing more than rough wooden benches and plain tables. Their conversations focused on Elizabeth's numerous spiritual shortcomings rather than her political achievements. These men have spent so much time studying scripture that they've apparently forgotten how earthly government actually works, approaching the question of royal authority with the same rigid literalism they apply to biblical interpretation. What's particularly soporific about Puritan criticism of Elizabeth is how it operates through endless cycles of theological hair-splitting that would challenge the patience of professional philosophers. These debates have the drowsy quality of academic seminars that go on far too long, with participants raising increasingly obscure points about ceremonial practices, ecclesiastical appointments, and the precise degree of reformation that God actually requires from earthly rulers. You can almost feel your eyelids growing heavy as earnest voices discuss whether Elizabeth's retention of bishops represents a fundamental compromise with Antichrist, or merely an unfortunate concession to political necessity. The specific complaints that Puritan extremists level against Elizabeth reveal how thoroughly religious perfectionism can transform political loyalty into theological betrayal. Her tolerance of ceremonial elements in church services, her appointment of insufficiently reformed bishops, her failure to completely eliminate Catholic practices from English worship, all of these become evidence that she has betrayed the Protestant cause, despite being the very monarch who established England's independence from Rome. The whole critique has the circular logic of people who have defined success so narrowly that failure becomes inevitable. The practical implications of Puritan dissatisfaction with Elizabeth create a political atmosphere where the Queen finds herself attacked from both sides simultaneously, with Catholic conspirators plotting her death for being too Protestant, while Protestant extremists condemn her for being insufficiently reformed. You can almost feel the exhaustion that comes from trying to maintain a middle course between equally demanding religious factions, each one convinced that compromise represents betrayal of fundamental principles. The whole situation has the drowsy inevitability of trying to please everyone and succeeding in satisfying no one. What makes Puritan threats particularly sleep-inducing is how they emerge, not from passionate calls to action, but from lengthy theological treatises that analyze Elizabeth's spiritual failures. With the methodical thoroughness of doctoral dissertations, these documents have the soporific quality of academic writing at its most pedantic, with every criticism carefully documented through scriptural citations and cross-references to various Reformed theologians. The whole enterprise feels like watching someone build an elaborate intellectual case for revolution, while remaining too polite to actually advocate violence. The international dimension of Puritan criticism connects English religious extremists with their counterparts in Scotland, Geneva, and the Low Countries, creating networks of correspondence that focus more on theological purity than political coordination. These letters have the drowsy rhythm of scholarly debates conducted across vast distances, with participants spending months crafting responses to points that may no longer be relevant by the time their replies arrive. Historians still argue whether these international connections actually posed a serious threat to Elizabeth's security or simply provided an outlet for religious frustration that might otherwise have found more dangerous expressions. The generational aspect of Puritan dissatisfaction reveals how religious movements can gradually shift from supporting established authority to questioning its fundamental legitimacy. Older Puritans who remember the religious chaos of Mary's reign generally support Elizabeth, despite her compromises, while younger radicals who have grown up under Protestant rule see her moderation as a necessary accommodation to popish error. You can almost feel the slow drift of opinion as theological students become ministers. Ministers become community leaders, and community leaders begin to wonder whether godly reformation might require more dramatic changes in leadership. The psychological profile of Protestant extremists who threaten Elizabeth differs markedly from their Catholic counterparts, operating from positions of frustrated expectation rather than desperate opposition. These men genuinely believed that Elizabeth's accession would herald a golden age of reformed religion, and her failure to meet their utopian expectations feels like personal betrayal rather than political disagreement. Their complaints have the particularly soporific quality of disappointed idealists who cannot understand why reality refuses to conform to their carefully constructed theories. Remember how Edward Squire's plot represented the height of technical sophistication. In assassination planning, Puritan threats against Elizabeth operate on exactly the opposite principle, emerging from abstract theological reasoning rather than practical planning for violence. Most of these extremists seem more interested in publishing pamphlets than sharpening daggers. Approaching the question of royal authority is an intellectual problem, rather than a physical challenge to be overcome through force. The literary dimension of Puritan criticism produces some of the most sleep-inducing political writing in English history, with authors carefully constructing arguments that Elizabeth has violated her coronation oath by failing to establish truly reformed religion. Throughout her realm, these treatises have the drowsy quality of legal briefs written by people who believe that logic alone can reshape political reality, complete with number points, subsidiary arguments, and careful qualifications that drain all urgency from their revolutionary implications. The ultimate ineffectiveness of Puritan threats against Elizabeth demonstrates how intellectual opposition without practical organization poses little genuine danger to established authority, regardless of how thoroughly reasoned the criticism might be. These religious extremists succeed mainly in creating a climate of constant theological scrutiny that makes every royal decision subject to detailed scriptural analysis, transforming even routine government business into occasions for lengthy debates about divine will and earthly responsibility. So here you are, nestled into a plot that's not really about killing Queen Elizabeth I outright. How refreshing. Well, kind of. It's still treason, just with a softer edge. We're now inside the curious, cobbled-together conspiracy known as the Biplot, which historians sometimes treat like a low-budget spin-off of the more famous Babington drama. If Babington was the blockbuster, the Biplot is the straight-to-DVD sequel. And yet, it still almost got off the ground. You're in the year 1603 now. Elizabeth's long reign has ended, and her successor, King James I, has just taken the throne. Wait, did you blink? Sorry. Yes, she's gone now. But the remnants of the old conspiracies linger like mildew behind the throne. The Biplot is aimed at James, not Elizabeth, but its roots are tangled in the soil of her reign. And since we're following the thread of how Elizabeth survived 20 assassination attempts, this section shows how even after her death, the tentacles of anti-Elizabethan anger squirmed on. Let's rewind just a little. While Elizabeth was still alive, tensions between Catholic recusants and the Protestant regime had reached new levels of simmer. On paper, Catholics were merely fined for refusing to attend Protestant church services. In practice, their homes were raided, their books confiscated, and their priests executed or exiled. You don't just forgive and forget that overnight. So even after Elizabeth's death, the resentment hadn't gone anywhere, it had just gone underground. Enter William Watson and William Clark, the Catholic priests, two men with the same first name and a surprisingly sketchy grasp of political subtlety. Their goal: to kidnap King James and force him to grant Catholics greater tolerance in England. But of course, they didn't just come up with this while sipping tea and sharing a scone. Their plan had been marinating for years, likely whispered over confessionals, over long candlelit dinners with other disillusioned men, and probably while pacing cold monastery halls at 2 a.m. You're walking with them now. Watson is the more impulsive of the two. Clark's more reserved, but not by much. Their plot sounds like something scribbled on the back of a tavern receipt: seize the king, lock down parliament, negotiate religious freedom, and get help from some disaffected Protestant nobles. Yes, Protestant. It's almost like politics makes strange bedfellows or something. They even approached George Brooke, the younger brother of Lord Cobham, a Protestant noble who, how do we say this gently, was not known for excellent decision-making. Historians still argue whether the biplot was ever seriously viable or whether it was more of a fantasy scribbled out of frustration. It lacked military support, royal insider help, and, frankly, any real secrecy. The conspirators were not subtle. Letters were intercepted, names were named. Spies leaked details, like a broken colander. And as you can probably guess, once word reached King James's chief advisors, the whole thing unraveled faster than a poorly stitched ruff. The twist. Some believe the plot may have been encouraged or at least manipulated by certain government figures, possibly even Robert Cecil, Elizabeth's old Secretary of State, who now served James. Why? Well, having a plot to thwart gave James a reason to crack down on Catholics early in his reign, flex his divine right of king's muscles, and tidy up some political threats in one neat public trial. Whether that's true or just early modern conspiracy theory fodder, you decide. But imagine you're Watson or Clark. You've put everything on the line for what you believe is justice. Now, you're shackled in the Tower of London. It's damp. Your cellmate smells like regret and wet wool. You're interrogated for hours, asked the same questions over and over until you forget what you really said and what they told you you said. You're offered deals, denied sleep, maybe shown the rack just for atmosphere. Eventually, you're tried and sentenced to death. Clark reportedly regrets nothing. Watson claims he only wanted peace. It doesn't really matter. Their fates are sealed. They're executed in 1603. If this feels a little out of sync, like the coda of a song you thought had already ended, that's the point. Even after Elizabeth's death, her long, paranoid reign continued to cast shadows. Now, you might be thinking, kidnapping. That's still not an assassination. And you're right technically, but it's a cousin to the same political disease. The biplot was built on the belief that monarchs, once held sacred and untouchable, were now movable pieces on a chessboard. And where there's one attempt to kidnap, there are always whispers of plans more lethal. If the biplot had succeeded, if negotiations had failed, if James had resisted, who's to say a dagger wouldn't have followed? Quirky side note, the word by and biplot doesn't mean goodbye. It refers to the plot's by the way status as secondary scheme compared to the bigger, bolder main plot. Yes, that was its real name, which aimed to replace James with Lady Arabella Stuart. So you had a main plot and a biplot running almost in parallel, which sounds more like a Renaissance sitcom than real life. But there it is. You take a slow breath. The candle sputters beside you. The voices of Watson and Clark fade into history, and you're left with a quiet awareness that Queen Elizabeth's reign was not just marked by those who tried to kill her, but also by those who, even after her death, carried the legacy of resistance, tangled, desperate, and ultimately doomed. The candle flickers on your desk as you lean in to examine a creased map of Europe. Dotted lines stretch across the channel like veins routes of couriers, spies, smugglers, and soldiers. Outside, the English wind howls. But inside this dim room, you trace the movements of kings, popes, and plotters with your fingertip. Because the truth is, Elizabeth's enemies weren't just hiding in dark London taverns. No, some of them were sipping wine in velvet halls, speaking perfect French or Latin, and sending gold and poison across borders. By now, you understand the game. Elizabeth wasn't simply dodging daggers from homegrown radicals. She was ducking entire foreign policies. Catholic courts across Europe, especially Spain and the Papal States, believed her death wasn't just convenient, it was divinely ordained. It's almost sweet, in a bloodthirsty kind of way. Let's start in Spain, where King Philip II is still very salty about that whole "you turned down my marriage proposal" thing. Oh, and about the English Navy helping pirates harass his treasure fleets, and the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. Honestly, his grudge list is longer than a Lenten fast. So he decides, multiple times, that killing Elizabeth or at the very least removing her might just fix Europe's theological balance. And yes, that's the same Philip from the Spanish Armada. Spoiler alert, ships don't work so well against storms or sea dogs. So, in the late 1580s and 1590s, Philip throws gold at every Catholic hopeful with a sharp knife and a loose plan. He funds seminary priests in exile. He supports Jesuits who enter England under false names. And just to spice things up, he allies with France's Catholic League and encourages Irish rebels. If you thought your ex was vengeful, try being the Protestant Queen of England when your former suitor is funding your assassination via 3 countries and a bishop. But it's not just Spain. You've also got the Vatican quietly cheering from the papal balcony. Remember when Pope Pius V excommunicated Elizabeth back in 1570? That papal bull was basically the church's way of saying, feel free to overthrow her. We won't mind. It opened the theological floodgates if your immortal soul was at stake. Why not dabble in a little light regicide? This moral green light encouraged networks of exiled English Catholics, many living in France, Flanders, and Rome. There, in musty libraries and echoing chapels, they whispered plans and sent letters written in invisible ink. Some of these exiles were sincere and desperate to restore their old faith. Others, well, let's just say they had more ambition than common sense. One of the more colorful examples, a man named Richard Williams, an English conspirator working out of Rouen, who wrote letters so stuffed with poetic rhetoric that even other plotters found them tiresome. His big idea? To infiltrate Elizabeth's court disguised as a Spanish musician. Historians still argue whether this was a serious plan or just an early draft of The Masked Singer. Regicide edition. Meanwhile, the French court often found itself playing both sides. Some nobles supported Elizabeth's enemies, while others benefited from English alliances that made Paris a perfect spy nest diplomatic balls. By day, cloak and dagger letters by night. And don't forget Scotland. Even after Mary's execution, Scottish nobles had their own opinions about English politics, and the borderlands were a mess of intrigue, smuggling, and backroom deals. All these efforts needed coordination. That's where courier networks came in. Messengers some, trained, others just desperate to ferry secret missives between plotters. Disguised in everything from books to loaves of bread. One agent famously stitched a message into the lining of his doublet, only to forget where he hid it and accidentally deliver someone's laundry instead. Not exactly MI6. Of course, England wasn't blind to these threats. Walsingham's spy network, remember that, was still humming. Even after his death, his successors used torture, forgery, and strategic leaks to disrupt European schemes. They intercepted letters, turned double agents, and spread misinformation like jam on a Tudor biscuit. One favorite tactic, sending counter-conspirators to Europe, pretending to be disgruntled English Catholics. These agents provocateurs would lure foreign supporters into fake plots, then capture them in stings worthy of any spy drama. It was dangerous work, one slip of the tongue, and you'd end up as a footnote in someone else's confession. But as the century wound down, the foreign assassination schemes grew clumsier. Funding dried up. Young Catholic nobles grew wary. Even Philip II, drained from war and Armada disasters, shifted focus toward other conflicts. It turns out, 20 years of trying to murder someone with zero success can be a little discouraging. And Elizabeth, you're still here, right beside her. She's older now, slower perhaps, but still sharp. She knows about the plots. She reads the intercepted letters, frowns at the ciphers, and rarely sleeps without guards stationed just outside her chamber. Her gowns are stitched not just with pearls, but precaution. The foreign threats never quite vanish, but they lose their fangs. Not because Europe suddenly loves Elizabeth, but because history is moving on. Succession looms. James of Scotland begins looking more like an inevitability than a risk. And frankly, many European rulers decide they can get better results through diplomacy than daggers. But the shadows across Europe remain. Somewhere in Rome, A dusty drawer still holds a map of London with little ink notes. In Madrid, an old chest bears the seal of a long-dead ambassador. Inside letters promising gold for a queen's blood. Forgotten schemes. Silent regrets. Ghosts of plots that never quite happened. You sit back in your chair, the candle nearly spent. Outside, a breeze from the channel stirs the ivy. You wonder not just how she survived 20 attempts, but how many more were started, whispered, or imagined, and never even made it onto parchment. By now, it would be reasonable to ask, how did she survive it all? 20 years, dozens of plots, foreign kings, homegrown zealots, secret letters, poisoned gifts, daggers in the dark. And yet Elizabeth dies in her bed, not at the end of a blade. That's not just luck, that survival is a skill set. So let's take a moment to really unpack the secret weapons behind Elizabeth's improbable longevity. Not swords, not fleets, but something sharper: intelligence, performance, and paranoia. Let's start with the obvious. Francis Walsingham. The man ran Elizabeth's spy network like a one-man intelligence agency decades before MI6 was even a concept. He built webs of informants stretching from the streets of London to the palaces of Paris and the seminaries of Rome. He intercepted letters, decoded invisible ink, and recruited double agents. And he listened to whispers in taverns, to frightened exiles, to low-born couriers who noticed strange packages and inconsistent alibis. Walsingham didn't just react to threats, he provoked them. He baited conspirators into revealing themselves, gave them just enough rope, and then, well, you've seen the tower. That rope didn't go to waste. But intelligence was only part of the answer. Elizabeth understood something else. Power is theater. She turned her public image into armor. The Virgin Queen, Gloriana. She wasn't just a monarch, she was a myth in real time. With her pale makeup, ruffled gowns, and carefully crafted speeches, she became something larger than life, larger than politics, larger than assassination. Because how do you kill a symbol? Even her progression towards those royal road trips through the countryside were more than photo ops. They were diplomatic recon, a way to read the room, feel the pulse of the people, and remind nobles exactly who paid their bills. You can't plot against someone who just slept in your guest room and gave your wife a diamond. And yet, for all the splendor, Elizabeth lived under constant threat. She knew it, and she used it. That's the third secret: paranoia is policy. She created distance, physical and emotional, rarely alone, rarely unguarded. Even her closest advisors sometimes had to wait days for an audience. She moved unpredictably, changed routes, questioned everyone. This wasn't cowardice, it was calculus. She saw what happened to her mother, to her cousin, to dozens of courtiers who said the wrong thing or trusted the wrong person. Elizabeth learned that survival meant making everyone else just a little afraid, a little uncertain, a little off balance. That strategy extended to succession. She refused to name an heir, even late in life. Not because she didn't have options, but because naming an heir invited replacement. And in Tudor England, a popular heir was a dangerous thing. So she waited, deliberately, frustratingly, strategically, until the very end. Because Elizabeth understood that being queen wasn't just about ruling. It was about staying alive long enough to keep ruling. And it worked. No matter how many plots were hatched, funded, and uncovered, no one succeeded. Not Babington, not Parry, not the papal bulls or the seminary spies or the French saboteurs. They tried poison, gunpowder, foreign armies, forged letters, and false priests. They tried everything, but the queen remained. And when she finally did die peacefully, at age 69, it wasn't in shame or exile or in chains. It was on her terms, in her palace, surrounded by guards and legends. Because Elizabeth didn't just outlive her enemies, she outmaneuvered them every single time. And so, here you are now, standing in the soft twilight of Elizabeth's reign. She's aged. The bright copper curls now sit atop a head more often pained by headaches. Her famous temper has mellowed somewhat. The fire is still there, just quieter, more simmer than spark. But the assassination attempts fewer, far fewer, because by the late 1590s, England is no longer quite the vulnerable, isolated Protestant outpost it once was. It's a real player, a naval force to reckon with, a place where merchants grow wealthy, playwrights get cheeky, and the crown sits heavy but steady on Gloriana's head. The threats don't vanish entirely, of course. There are still murmurs, a Jesuit or two still sneaking about, a young idealist whispering to a friend who knows a guy in Antwerp. But they're not the same. Not organized, not grand, and crucially, not serious. It's hard to stir revolution when the would-be martyr is an old woman with no clear successor. Historians still argue whether this final calm was earned or simply fatigue was it Walsingham's old trap still snapping shut, or had everyone simply given up. Maybe it was both. Maybe watching the Babington conspirators get dragged to their doom took the romance out of martyrdom, or maybe the failure of the Spanish Armada made it crystal clear the Queen wasn't going anywhere. By this point, Elizabeth's succession or lack thereof hangs heavy in the air. People speculate, courtiers hedge their bets, eyes shift towards Scotland, where James VI, son of Mary Queen of Scots, waits in disciplined silence. He's Protestant educated, politically shrewd, and he's not making waves. Elizabeth, as ever, stays silent. She still refuses to name him, even as the nobles start practicing how to pronounce Majesty with a Scottish accent. She knows too well what happens to heirs who become divisible too soon. After all, she was one once, so she keeps everyone guessing. A crown is a dangerous thing to pass around, and even as she withers, her appetite failing, her body shrinking beneath the velvet, she holds the crown firmly in place. The final years of her reign are filled with loss. Walsingham is gone. Leicester, too. Her sweet Robin died in 1588. Essex, the charming but reckless court favorite, is executed for treason in 1601 after a failed coup. Elizabeth signs his death warrant herself, though not without tears. She becomes increasingly isolated, melancholic at times. It's said she simply sits for hours, unwilling to eat, unwilling to sleep, just watching, waiting. But she's still queen, still commanding when she must be, still feared when it counts. And finally, in March of 1603, the long vigil ends. Elizabeth I, the queen who outlasted 20 assassination attempts, dozens of uprisings, and the most powerful Catholic monarchies in Europe, slips into unconsciousness and dies. No bombs, no daggers, no poison, just breath fading. She leaves behind an empire on the rise, a Protestant legacy, a nation of poets, sailors, and spies, and a throne prepared, albeit grudgingly, for a new dynasty. James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England. The transition, for all its uncertainties, is peaceful. There's no coup, no rebellion, just a silent nod from history as the Tudor torch passes finally to someone else. You survived. Elizabeth, not by chance, not by luck, but through force of will, theater, and ruthless intelligence. You saw the knives behind the smiles, and you smiled anyway just long enough for your enemies to expose themselves. And now, with your body at rest, your legacy takes its own breath and rises, because death came for you so many times, and yet only once did it succeed. And now, as the shadows of the past dissolve and the candlelight of your imagination flickers low, let yourself drift a little, slower and softer. The footsteps of conspirators fade behind you now, and the cold stone walls of the tower blur into a gentler kind of silence. You've traveled through the whispers of spies, the tremble of poison in silver cups, the coded ink and cautious letters, all the heavy breathing of those who tried to undo a queen, and failed. You followed her, not as ruler or myth, but as a woman who lived beneath constant threat, who woke each morning unsure if it might be her last. And yet, she dressed, she smiled, she ruled. Now, breathing, Let your mind drift to quieter places, velvet curtains rustling in the breeze, the soft clip of horses in the courtyard, the rhythmic scratch of a quill on parchment. Everything slows, even the past. You are safe here. No daggers, no secrets, just the hush of memory, cooling like evening rain. Let your thoughts wander where they like now, without pressure, without urgency, because you've made it. You've seen Elizabeth through her peril and out the other side. You've walked the halls with her, peered through her eyes, and maybe, just maybe, understood a little of what it means to survive the impossible. So, close your eyes if they aren't already. Let the last golden threads of story unwind. No need to hold on. The danger's past. The Queen is at peace, and so are you.